In the 1850s, in the city of New York, something in the milk was taking the lives of infants by the thousands, not occasionally, not in isolated cases. The New York Times would later report an estimate that in a single year, 8,000 of the city's youngest residents died from the same cause. Their mothers fed them milk, bought from wagons that rolled through the streets with the words "pure country milk" painted on the side. The milk was not pure. It was not from the country, and it was not, by any honest definition, milk. What was inside those bottles had begun its journey in a whiskey distillery. The leftover mash from the fermentation of rye and barley, a hot, acidic, nutrient-depleted slurry that distillers called swill, was piped directly into sheds attached to the distilleries, where hundreds of cows stood in narrow stalls, chained in place, fed nothing but this fermented waste for the remainder of their lives. The milk those cows produced was thin and bluish, nearly devoid of the fats and nutrients that made real milk nourishing. To disguise it, dealers added water, thickened the mixture with starch and eggs, whitened it with chalk or plaster of Paris, and tinted it with molasses to simulate the golden color of cream. Then they loaded it onto wagons and sold it to the poorest families in the city, the ones who could not afford milk shipped from rural farms. Nobody told the mothers what was in the bottles. Nobody was required to. New York City in the 1850s was a place where growth outpaced every rule. The population had surpassed 500,000. Immigrants arrived by the thousands. Housing was overcrowded, sanitation was primitive, and the demand for milk, considered essential for infant nutrition and widely used as a substitute for breast milk, far exceeded what the surrounding countryside could supply. Shipping fresh milk from farms in Orange and Westchester counties was expensive and unreliable. Without refrigeration, it often soured before reaching the city. Rural milk was beyond what the poorest families could afford. The distillery dairies offered a solution that was as efficient as it was lethal. By housing cows inside the city, attached directly to whiskey distilleries and feeding them on industrial waste, producers could deliver milk to market the same day, at prices the poor could pay. By the late 1850s, records suggest that nearly half of all the milk consumed in New York City came from these operations. The economics were irresistible. A distiller paid roughly 6 cents per cow per day for the swill, the feeding, and the milking, a fraction of what it cost to raise a cow on hay and pasture. The same distiller sold the resulting milk to dealers who adulterated it further and sold it to mothers at market price. The profits were enormous. The oversight was non-existent, and the cows themselves were deteriorating. Accounts from the period describe animals so weakened by their diet and confinement that they had to be suspended in slings to keep them from collapsing. The acidity of the swill caused their teeth to fall out and their bodies to break down. They stood for months, sometimes years, in cramped, airless sheds, and every day, twice a day, they were milked, and what came out of them was loaded onto wagons labeled pure. The children who drank this milk developed what physicians of the era called cholera infantum, a devastating intestinal illness that was particularly lethal in infants. In the 1850s, germ theory had not yet taken hold. Doctors did not understand that the milk was teeming with bacteria bred in the filth of the distillery sheds. Many attributed the deaths to summer heat, others blamed teething. The deaths were considered tragic but ordinary, part of the expected cost of raising children in a crowded city. If you've been watching this channel, you know this is the part of the story where someone looks closer. Someone always does. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because every episode ends with the law catching up to what was hidden. And here's a question for the comments. When you buy milk, do you ever look at the word pasteurized on the label? After this story, you'll understand exactly why it's there. The first person to look closely was a man named Robert Hartley, a social reformer and temperance advocate who published an essay in 1842 describing the conditions in the swill dairies and warning that the milk they produced was unfit for human consumption. Hartley's work was thorough and alarming. It was also ignored. His association with the temperance movement made him easy to dismiss. Critics argued that his opposition to the distilleries was ideological, not scientific, that he wanted to shut down whiskey production, and the milk was merely a convenient excuse. Without germ theory, without laboratory analysis, without the ability to prove what was in the milk, Hartley's warnings went nowhere. The distillers continued. The children continued to die. 16 years passed before anyone tried again. In May of 1858, a publisher named Frank Leslie, an English immigrant who had founded Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper 3 years earlier, received a delivery of milk at his home that was so visibly contaminated that it prompted him to investigate. What began as personal outrage became the most ambitious piece of investigative journalism New York had seen. Leslie dispatched reporters and artists into the distillery dairies of Manhattan and Brooklyn. They infiltrated the sheds, documented the conditions, and produced detailed illustrations of what they found. The artists worked at considerable risk. Several were physically attacked by dairy workers who discovered discovered them sketching the stalls. The series that Frank Leslie's published was devastating. 5,000 words of reporting accompanied by full-page illustrations that showed emaciated cows covered in sores, held upright by ropes, standing in pools of their own waste while workers milked them in near darkness. The paper published precise maps showing which street corners sold Swill Milk and which dairies produced it. The reporters traced the distribution chain from distillery to dealer to wagon to doorstep, naming the distillers, naming the streets, naming the aldermen who had looked the other way, and the language was unsparing. The paper called the producers milk murderers and wrote, "For the midnight assassin, we have the rope and the gallows, for the robber, the penitentiary. But for those who murder our children by the thousands, we have neither reprobation nor punishment." The New York Times echoed the outrage. An editorial ran under the headline, "How We Poison Our Children," demanding to know how the deaths of 8,000 infants in a single year had failed to move the city's officials to action. Other newspapers picked up the story. The Times described the milk in terms that left nothing to the imagination, a contaminated compound that bore little resemblance to the product it claimed to be. The city, as one reporter put it, suffers nausea. The public response was immediate and furious. Angry crowds gathered outside the dairies, mothers organized. The Common Council was pressured to send a team of aldermen to inspect the premises. But what happened next revealed something worse than the milk itself. It revealed the system that protected it. The aldermen gave the distillery owners advance notice of the inspection, allowing them time to clean the stalls and remove the most visibly diseased cows. The investigation that followed was led by Alderman Michael Twomey, a Tammany Hall politician known as Butcher Mike, who was, in any honest assessment, the last person who should have been in charge. Frank Leslie's newspaper staked out the mansion of distillery owner Bradish Johnson and reported that Twomey was observed making late-night visits during the investigation. In the hearings that followed, Twomey and fellow aldermen E. Harrison Reed and William Tucker did not investigate the dairies. They attacked the people who had exposed them. They called expert witnesses unreliable. They turned the proceedings into what one account described as a one-sided exercise designed to make the critics look ridiculous. Twomey went so far as to argue publicly that Swill Milk was as good for children as, or better than, regular milk. The Board of Health exonerated the distillers. Frank Leslie responded by publishing a cartoon that showed the alderman painting the sickly cows white, while a distiller slipped a bag of money into Twomey's pocket. The cartoon ran in newspapers across the city. Twomey earned a new nickname that would follow him for the rest of his career: Swill Milk Twomey. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because the story didn't end with the cover-up. And here's a question: has there ever been a product you trusted completely, only to find out later you shouldn't have? Leslie did not stop. Despite the Board of Health's exoneration, despite the political protection the distillers enjoyed, Leslie continued publishing. He ran follow-up investigations. He kept naming names, and the pressure, sustained, public, and impossible for elected officials to ignore forever, eventually reached the state legislature. In 1862, New York passed its first milk regulation law, banning the sale of adulterated milk and establishing the earliest framework for dairy inspection in the United States. Twomey fought the regulations, earning himself yet another title in the process. He became known as the man who tried to block the law that would have saved the children. He'd argued didn't need saving. The law was imperfect. Enforcement was weak, and the distillery dairies did not vanish overnight. Some simply moved their operations or found subtler ways to adulterate their product. But the 1862 law marked a turning point that cannot be understated. For the first time in American history, a government body had formally declared that what went into milk was a matter of public concern, and that the people selling it could be held accountable for its contents. The problem the law could not solve, however, was the one that had been killing children all along: bacteria. Regulation could ban the most obvious adulterants: the chalk, the plaster, the molasses. But without refrigeration, even clean milk from healthy pasture-fed cows spoiled rapidly in the summer heat, and in spoiling, it became a breeding ground for pathogens that the science of the 1860s could not yet identify, let alone eliminate. The law addressed the fraud. It could not address the biology. The answer had been discovered years earlier in a different country for a different purpose. In the 1860s, the French scientist Louis Pasteur had demonstrated that heating a liquid to a specific temperature for a sustained period could kill the microorganisms responsible for spoilage and disease. Pasteur had been working with wine and beer, not milk. But in the 1880s, the German chemist Franz von Soxhlet proposed applying the same technique to the dairy supply. And by the 1890s, the process, now called pasteurization in Pasteur's honor, was being tested in American cities. It was tested in large part because one man decided to pay for it himself. Nathan Straus was the co-owner of two of New York's largest department stores. He was wealthy, prominent, deeply civic-minded, and personally devastated. Between 1878 and 1893, he and his wife Lena lost children to disease. At least one of those deaths was believed to have been caused by contaminated milk. Then, in 1892, a cow on Straus's own upstate farm died unexpectedly. He ordered an autopsy. The animal's lungs were riddled with tuberculosis. Straus became convinced, with the certainty of a parent who has buried a child, that the untreated milk of that era, unrefrigerated, uninspected, and sold without any sanitary controls, was the vehicle transmitting the diseases that were taking children across the city, and that the technology Louis Pasteur had pioneered decades earlier was the only reliable way to make it safe. In 1893, at his own expense, Straus built a pasteurization plant on East 3rd Street in Manhattan and opened the first of what would eventually become 18 milk depots across New York City. The depots sold pasteurized milk for a penny a glass. Mothers who could not afford even that received vouchers to cover the cost or got the milk free. In 1894, he opened a milk laboratory on Avenue C in the Lower East Side, in the heart of the neighborhood where infant mortality was highest. The laboratory tested every batch of milk before distribution to ensure the pasteurization process had worked. In his first year, it distributed 34,000 bottles of safe milk per day. By 1905, that number had reached 3 million. The results were staggering. In 1891, fully 24% of babies born in New York City, nearly 1 in 4, died before their first birthday. Of the more than 20,000 children fed pasteurized milk through Straus's depots over a 4-year period, 6 died. The child mortality rate in neighborhoods served by his milk stations dropped from 126 per thousand to 74.5. When the New York City Health Department tested Straus's operation in 1905, they confirmed that milk, which had been infected with tuberculosis bacteria, was rendered completely safe by the pasteurization process. The data was overwhelming. Straus made sure everyone saw it, but the dairy industry fought pasteurization with the same arguments it had used against every reform for half a century. It was too expensive. It would raise the price of milk beyond what poor families could afford. It was unnecessary, and untreated milk, producers of the era insisted, was perfectly safe if handled properly. And the real solution was better hygiene on farms, not expensive equipment in processing plants. Some industry representatives went further. They argued that pasteurization was a superficial fix, that heating the milk would encourage lazy producers to skip sanitary practices entirely, since the heat would kill the germs regardless. A writer in the Outlook magazine warned in 1908 that wholesale pasteurization, while lulling consumers into a false sense of security, would vastly increase the burdens of milk inspectors. Scientists suspicious of what they called newfangled interventions added their voices to the opposition. Some nutritionists of the era argued that heating milk reduced its nutritional value, a claim that Straus's own mortality data contradicted. Straus spent more than 2 decades fighting back. He lectured civic groups across the country. He bombarded political leaders with letters documenting the mortality data from his milk depots. He built pasteurization plants not only in New York but in cities across the United States and in Europe, demonstrating the technique to foreign governments and proving that it could work at scale. His wife Lina worked alongside him for every year of the campaign. They spent the majority of their personal fortune on the effort. The tide turned slowly but decisively. In 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt's Surgeon General released a 600-page report that attributed most childhood deaths to impure milk and endorsed pasteurization as the most effective remedy. Chicago became the first major American city to mandate pasteurization by law. New York City, the city where the Swill Milk scandal had begun, where 8,000 infants had died in a single year, where Alderman Tuomi had argued that contaminated milk was good for children, finally mandated pasteurization in 1914. Other cities followed. By the 1920s, pasteurization was required across the country, and Congress had enacted national milk safety regulation. Nathan Straus was called the most useful citizen in New York in 1923. He donated his pasteurization plant to the city in 1920 and turned his milk depots over to public agencies. The infrastructure he had built with private money became public health infrastructure, absorbed into the government systems that would protect the milk supply for every generation that came after. His brother Isidore and sister-in-law Ida had perished on the Titanic in 1912. A loss that deepened Nathan's conviction that life was fragile and that wealth existed to be used in its defense. He spent the last years of his life extending his health campaigns to Palestine, building pasteurization plants and clinics for Jewish and Arab communities alike. The Israeli city of Netanya is named in his honor, but the monument that mattered most to him was never a city or a building. It was a word on a milk carton. The word pasteurized on every carton of milk sold in the United States today is, in a direct and documented sense, the legacy of a man who lost his own children and refused to let the loss remain meaningless. 8,000 children a year. That was the number the New York Times reported in the 1850s. 8,000 infants in a single city in a single year, drinking milk from cows that stood in their own waste, fed on whiskey slop held upright by ropes because they were too sick to stand on their own. The milk was was thinned with water, whitened with plaster, labeled pure, and sold to mothers who had no way to know what they were buying. And when the children died, the doctors blamed the heat. The next time you pick up a carton of milk, any brand, any store, anywhere, look at it. Not at the price, not at the expiration date. Look at the single word printed on the front, in small letters, that you've probably read 1,000 times without thinking about it. Pasteurized. That word is there because of the 8,000. Because a temperance reformer tried to warn the city in 1842 and no one would listen. Because a publisher received contaminated milk at his own front door in 1858 and decided to send his artists into the distillery sheds to draw what they found. Because a politician named Tuomi argued at the hearings that the contaminated milk was good for children, and a cartoonist drew him taking money from the distiller. Because a department store owner buried his own children, watched a cow die of tuberculosis on his farm, and spent the rest of his life building milk stations in the poorest neighborhoods of the city so that other parents would not have to bury theirs. The word doesn't explain any of this. It doesn't need to. It simply means the milk is safe, because someone a long time ago made sure it would be.